Don't chew with your mouth open. Think before you speak. Stop slouching and sit up straight. These are all things that my mom would remind me over and over again growing up. It seemed like she was on my case for something all the time, or at least it felt that way. Moms have this knack of seeing or knowing that you could do better. And my mom would not hold back in letting me know what I needed to fix. Think of the term mother loosely, since we have all kinds of moms in our lives. You know, we may have had our mama or a grandma who raised us. We may have a work mom, and then sometimes we have a church mom. Thinking back to these mothers and adopted mothers in your life, what is the advice or principles that you remember? Turn with me to Proverbs 31, where a mom tried to implant an idea. Proverbs 31. Most of you know this as the place where a superpowered woman is described, the seemingly impossible Proverbs 31 woman. However, let's take a look at the introduction of this section, because this chapter is not originally the words of a man. These are originally the words of a mother to her son. The summary of the motherly advice of these first 9 verses is the point today. Your decisions affect those around you. Your decisions affect those around you. Proverbs 31, verse 1, my New King James has the heading, the words of King Lemuel's mother. So in verse 1 it says, the words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. The topic this mother is sharing is royal advice. It's to her son, the king. Chances are you're not in the royal succession to the British monarchy, but since the people of God are labeled as a royal priesthood in 1 Peter and a kingdom of priests in Exodus 19 and Revelation 1, there's an undeniable aspect of royalty to our calling as Christians. So this isn't just for kings or presidents. We should perk up to royal advice. Second, let's talk about the characters. As is true for most biblical topics, scholars argue as to who they are. The first camp, including UCG's own commentary, say that Lemuel was likely a king from another Middle Eastern country. Traditionally, however, most Jewish sources teach King Lemuel was a pet name for King Solomon, which would make this motherly royal advice coming from none other than Bathsheba. I'm not going to assume that this advice was to King Solomon. However, we will try to get insight using both possibilities as a lens to understand what this mother was trying to get at. If we look at this first verse, the chapter begins by saying the king was taught these oracles by his mother. The Hebrew word for taught isn't as genteel as it sounds in English, but actually means to discipline, chasten, admonish. Much like the way my mom would probably get on my case, and possibly the way your mom did to you. While going through admonishment, it's never fun. But usually, if we listen, we really appreciate it later in life. Just the fact that here is recorded a king's mother's words is a really big deal. Most of the Bible is words inspired by God, spoken through a man. But here is highlighted wisdom from a woman who also was a mom. No matter how annoying it was at the time to be chastened, our moms generally have a bit of wisdom to share, and she considers her word carefully in verse 2, reminding the king of their relationship. What should I share, she says, or as some commentaries put it, what are you doing, my dear son, that I have dedicated to God? If this was Bathsheba, remember, she lost her first child with David. Lemuel means belonging to God, and it would be totally natural her vowing to God with her second child, Solomon, a life of service. Now, with verses 3 through 9, we get into the meat of her advice. Since our decisions affect those around us, she argues we need to make sure that we have a good sense of self-control in order to make those good decisions. She highlights giving your strength to women or your ways to that which destroys kings in verse 3, but then partners that in verse 4 that talks about strong, intoxicating drink. So what do out-of-control relationships and getting drunk have in common? Well, actually everything, because they're pretty similar in how they mess with our brain. The Baker commentary on Proverbs 31 says, the problem has to do with one's ability to make good decisions if under the influence. A clear mind is important to the wise person. It is very important for a king to know what he is doing as he makes decisions, because his decisions have important ramifications for many people, end quote. That last part, important ramifications for many people, caught my eye, and it made me think of culture. If you're like my friends that have raised kids, then you know the family culture you decide to create is one important aspect that influences your little ones. Modeling behavior, interactions, and how to work through problems sets them up for who they're going to be as adults. Likewise, the more I've learned about my home here in the United States, and specifically in Western Washington, the more I learn about how individualistic the culture is. Stick to your own life, be nice if you have to interact, but my life is separate from everyone else. This is the culture that we're steeped in, and it affects how we treat each other, including in church, if we don't actively decide to do something different. The Christian's life is described in 1 Corinthians 12, not as individualistic, but as a member of a body. Yes, there's individual responsibility, but we function together. The finger can't do anything without the hand and the arm and a brain to direct it all. But it's fairly easy to drink the alcoholic Kool-Aid and believe I don't need anybody else and nobody needs me. The truth is, we need each other, and we need Christ as our head. An individualistic drunken stupor can happen really, really easy in a busy life with work, family, insane Seattle traffic, let alone alcohol and relationships. The king's mom warns in verse 5 that getting swept away by all this focus on only ourselves, rather than thinking of our role with our broad family, leads us to forgetting the law and perverting justice. We need God, but we need each other too. If this was Bathsheba talking to Solomon, this was pretty damning to the life Solomon eventually lived in his old age, with 1,000 different women's belief systems that he failed to say no to, which led to him building pagan temples and perverting of justice, and eventually splitting of his own kingdom. Having wisdom is one thing, it's data, but deciding on that wisdom is completely different. Self-control can be made easier if we consider the ramifications of our decisions on others. The king's mother's advice builds on having a clear enough mind for self-control by her admonition to speak up for those that do not have a voice. You'll notice in verses 8 and 9 here in Proverbs 31, both start with open your mouth. Some commentaries point out that the contrast here is rather than filling it with alcohol, use it to speak for others, to defend, to protect, to build up those that are beat up, condemned, or sidelined. If you watch the recorded coronation of King Charles III from this past week, an actual monarch, a real monarch, this same instruction was given to him by the reading of Luke 4, which is where Christ reads the scroll of Isaiah that says that he came to heal the brokenhearted, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. This aspect of Christ's life where he openly talked to, cared for, and ate with the outcasts of society, made him look quite different than the teachers of that particular time. Christ offered hope, healing, and context for what was going on. The words associated with the beginning of both ministries, that of Christ and of King Charles, focused on the idea of a life of service, a high and worthy calling, the pursuit you and I have been called to. If this advice was to a young King Solomon directly, we could reasonably speculate that this speaking up for those without a voice came from a memory of someone misusing power. To be direct, was this Bathsheba not wanting the past to repeat itself? Did she remember the parable that Nathan the prophet told King David about the poor man with a single little ewe lamb that the rich man stole? Bathsheba herself was the ewe lamb that David stole from Uriah. When we don't speak up, defend, or help those without a voice, we forget our decisions affect those around us. In this first part of Proverbs 31, we have the advice of a mother to her son, the king. The advice doesn't center around stopping her son from chewing with his mouth open, but contains royal advice. She highlights how he doesn't live in a vacuum, quite the opposite, actually, that he has to remember to keep his mind clear from any kind of intoxication, whether it be from drink, from relationship, or even getting lost in yourself. Because decisions are important. The way to deal with that is to remember that we must look out for those around us, to speak up, to stand in the gap. So, may we remember to love our mamas and remember this mother's advice in your prayers. Your decisions affect those around you.